Ciao, everybody. As you can see, I'm near the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and this is something you guys might not know about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Do you know that it's actually not leaning? It's just the entire town is leaning. So if you go up and measure the tower itself, you'll see that it's straight up and down to gravity, but the entire town, for some reason, is leaning the other way. Okay? No? You don't buy it? Okay, well, I tried. Anyway, hope you're all doing well. Hope you all had a nice weekend. And I think we can just get right started because we haven't had a test recently and don't need to talk about that. So let's talk about a little bit more touch. Again, one of the interesting things about touch is that it kind of exemplifies some of the more interesting things about the brain in general. We talked last class about plasticity, both in terms of how our touch brains change the more we touch things and the more kind of specialized we become in touch. And then also that really cool idea, something I'm really interested in my lab, is cross-modal plasticity, cross-sensory plasticity, where the senses start to compensate for each other as not only we lose a sense, but also as we grow and our senses become a little bit degraded, we start to see the other senses make use of the part of the brain that used to be dedicated to that sense that's now been degraded through age a little bit. So now we're going to move to other really interesting aspects of touch that aren't necessarily related to plasticity, but you'll see, or directly related to plasticity, but you'll see some expertise playing a really important role here. So let's go ahead and share our screens. Okay, yes. Oops, sorry. Just a second, we'll be right there. I think I should probably take off my silly hat, although it is that mustache again. I'm thinking of not growing a quarantine beard, full beard, but growing one of these mustaches, which I would then dye black and actually use wax to kind of curve the handlebars. A lot of people have said I look very nice in this sort of mustache. Okay, so hold on just a second. Oops, hold on, sorry. I need to stop sharing and take off my mustache, much to my disappointment, and then start sharing again. There I am. Okay, again, not as dapper and as sophisticated as with the mustache. Nonetheless, we do need to teach. Okay, so you know a little bit about this because I had you folks watch that movie on Helen Keller in your discussion section. I thought you'd find it really interesting. And if you haven't watched it yet, I know that was one of those things the TAs asked you to watch on your own because the quality would be so much better if you were to watch it on your own computer. Definitely watch it. I think you're going to find it fascinating. And then there will be at least a question or two that you'll need to answer on the exam that's in that movie. Nothing too complicated, no details, but there's some themes I want you to pick up on as you go through. And if you just watch it and concentrate, I'm sure you'll do well on that question or two. But I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about my own experience with something that Helen Keller does, and that is to touch faces in order to hear speech or to perceive speech. And so the person we're going to be talking about is this person I met, and if you read through the book chapter, you know about him. This is Rick Joy, and Rick is right here. He is the person touching his friend's face. And sadly, Rick passed away last year, but he had an amazing life. I think he passed away in his mid-70s. But he had an amazing life, and when I met him, we had one of my, I think, most exciting interviews I did for the book. Rick lost his sight and his hearing by the age of 2. I think he was born blind, if I remember correctly, and then became deaf later on. And in his case, it was a result of meningitis. And back, for his generation, there actually were a lot of deafblind kids, or a lot, I would say many more than there are now. And part of that, interestingly, was a result of rubella. Maybe you've heard of rubella. That's one of the components that is now vaccinated when you're young. So the rubella, the mumps, and the measles, the MMR vaccine, the one that's sadly a little controversial, that has this component in it that vaccinates against rubella. And before we had that vaccine, rubella was much more common, and it was the cause of most deaf blindness in young children. So there was a sizable population of deaf blind kids around when he was born. But Rick really had a tremendous life. He was a bright, bright guy, and a really, I would say, engaged, socially skilled guy. I mean, that was one of the things that really struck me about him, was that despite the fact that he didn't have sight and hearing, he was able to have a lot of friends and have a lot of hobbies, and had a career and all that sort of thing. He received a college degree. He worked for Hewlett-Packard, I think, for 30 years or something like that. He designed circuit boards for Hewlett-Packard. And he just, was really able to accomplish so much. He was the first blind, deaf Boy Scout to get to the highest level, which is Eagle Scout. And I think, for that reason, ended up having a chance to meet a lot of dignitaries, not unlike Helen Keller. But it was really just amazing how he had set up his life to really make it much more usable for somebody who is blind deaf. He had a hobby called amateur radio. It used to be called ham radio. I don't know if it's very popular anymore now that the internet exists, but ham radio is something that people used to do to communicate with other people around the world cheaply and efficiently. So this was instead of hopping on the internet or using your phone, which would be very expensive back then. They had something called shortwave radio, and that signal would be able to be transmitted to, in theory, almost any place in the world to somebody who also had this. And being deaf and blind, he wasn't able to talk through the radio well. He couldn't hear, obviously. So what he would do is he would communicate through Morse code. And Morse code is something, you probably know what Morse code is. Those dots and dashes, those beeps, and tones that you sometimes see in spy movies. People use that sort of sound. He couldn't hear it, of course. So what he would do is he placed a little speaker, a little loudspeaker that was large enough that he could feel the vibrations of the loudspeaker with his finger. And he could decipher Morse code that way and send back a signal by tapping a little key, and would tell people that, in fact, he was deaf and blind, and this is the way he had to communicate. So would they mind doing it in Morse code? And I think at that point, everybody who had an amateur radio system had to learn Morse code. It is still used, by the way. I should just say this as an aside. In serious emergencies, emergencies where like the electronic grid, the internet all go down, I think it is considered kind of a way for communication to still be conveyed across the world, because most of these folks have their own generator system. And as long as they have their own generator, they don't need the internet, they don't need an electronic grid, they can communicate with everybody in the world. And that is kind of a last line of communication if there's an emergency in the world. So they're still active. There's still some people active, not as much as they used to be, but he had continued all the way through the end of his life to do this. When I was sitting there talking with him, I asked him, would he know if somebody came into a room? And he'd say yes. And in fact, I remember I was talking to him, sitting on a couch next to him, and his daughter, young daughter, I think she was 4 or 5 at the time, came bounding into the room, and he said something to her, and she responded. And I asked how he knew she was there, and he said, certainly with his daughter and with most people, he can feel the vibrations on the floor with his own feet to know that somebody else has entered the room. So, he had kind of learned to become sensitive to those sort of changes. So he knew people were in the room through, the vibrations on the floor. He knew people were behind him. He could sometimes feel like little kind of shifts of air on his neck, right? So he became more sensitive to this over time. And he really had a good sense of where he was in his house because of his memory of the layout of his house and where people were based on what was going on the floor, what was going on his skin as people moved back, past him. It was pretty amazing. Very brave guy. He when I talked to him, he had been retired for a few years from Hewlett Packard, and he had a number of hobbies. This amateur radio. He also, I think, he made what was it? Some sort of uh, things out of metal. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he also did a lot of home repair on his house. And he showed me he built his back patio. He put an antenna on his house. He fixed his roof, and he would tell me stories about his neighbors coming over and telling his wife, I saw Rick on the roof again, and it scares the heck out of me. Are you sure he's okay? And she would say, yeah, he's got a great sense of balance. He knows exactly where he is on the roof, and he's able to do it successfully. It's pretty amazing. I mean, that was something that again, I was so struck by, that he had really engaged in such a lively life. He had a wife and daughter. His wife was deaf, but his daughter was a hearing sighted person. And where I thought, man, meeting somebody like this, I would imagine they would feel so isolated from the world. And if you saw the Helen Keller movie, that at first she was. But once they learn to communicate, they can get as engaged with people, have as active a social life, and have hobbies, a career, and all this sort of thing. So it is really surprising, impressive, and such a sweet guy. I mean, a little bit about how he had to communicate with me, and he had to put his hand on my jaw and lips and understand my speech that way. And he just made very sure that I was comfortable with that. We talked a little bit about it, and I said, sure, yeah, that's why I'm here. I'm really interested in this technique that you've learned. I felt completely comfortable in my 2-hour interview with him touching my face pretty much the whole time, even though I had just met him. So let's talk a little bit about that. That's the thing I really am most interested in talking about today. And that is Rick's means for communicating. Rick, when he went deaf and blind, was kind of homeschooled for a while, but his parents wanted him to learn to communicate with other people. So they sent him to a school for the deaf and blind at about the age of 11. And there he learned this technique of understanding speech through touch. This technique is called the Tadoma technique. It's kind of an odd sounding name. It's a name of the first two people that were formally taught the technique. People, I think, had been kind of casually using the technique for a while, but this guy called Tad and a young woman named Oma were the first two people that were taught the technique at Rick's school. So they named the technique after him. It was developed in the 1950s, and Helen Keller, in fact, learned to do the same type of thing. As you can see, if you look at Helen Keller touching President Eisenhower's face and Rick touching his friend's face, you can see that they're using different types of hand techniques. Helen actually had her fingers over much of the face of the people she was talking with, and Rick liked to touch less of the face. But he was really interested in getting information from the neck. And different people had different techniques, but I'll show you that the most common technique is to put the thumb over the lips like this, and then put a finger across the jaw and the remaining fingers down by the voice box here, down by the larynx. And the idea is this way you could feel the lips move, which is important, feel the air come out between the lips, which is actually one of the most critical things, as it turns out. Feel the jaw movements with the first finger, and then feel the voice box, the vibrations, which again is going to be critically important here with these fingers here. And I asked Rick how come he doesn't put his fingers over the lips, across the lips, like Helen did in a different way. Why doesn't he use his thumb go across the lips? And he just felt that it made people feel more comfortable to have them under the lips, in order to not kind of go across their mouth. He felt that it was maybe people would feel it was a little unhygienic, and would not feel as comfortable. So he felt he got enough information just kind of tracking how the lower lip moved and curled as a person was speaking. These days, I should say, not too many people use it anymore. It's a handful of people, and there's a lot of reasons for this. One of the most obvious is that people who are born deafblind now often get cochlear implants. They get those devices that are implanted into the middle ear there that allow people to start to really understand speech. So they don't need the Tadoma technique to communicate. Also, there's lots of other things. A lot of Rick's friends actually are signers. They know how to sign. And if that's the case, if they know how to sign, Rick's in better shape. It's easier for Rick because what he can do is feel what's called tactile sign. And in fact, this is how his wife and he communicated. She came into the room one point and had to tell him something about their daughter having to, study for class or something. Make dinner or something. She was only 4. And Rick grabbed her hand and she just signed into her hand. And that was a very, very easy way for Rick to understand. He said that's an easier way to understand than actually touching somebody's face because the signs are so distinct. And the signs that are used in what's called tactile sign have been designed to be very easy to feel and to track. And there's other things as well, text to braille devices, which are much more prevalent when he was growing up, and then of course now all the ways we can get text on computer or on our iPhones to be read to us, audiobooks and all that sort of thing. So these days, it's not that common for people to know the technique very well at all. And when I interviewed Rick, he thought that he knew pretty much everybody in the country that knew the Tadoma technique. He had communicated with them through the internet, if not actually had met them. And he thought there were maybe 10 to 15 people that truly, truly relied on the technique still. For the most part, they are able to either hear because of cochlear implants or use other sorts of techniques where it wasn't that useful anymore to learn the technique, which is certainly hard. And so but I was most interested in this. So I chatted with him about how he finds the technique. And he says he's been doing it a long time. He does well with it. And I should tell you that it's when I talked to him, it was like communicating with somebody like in a noisy restaurant or a party, right? So if it's a noisy restaurant and you're talking to, say, your grandparents or something who are just, having a little hearing loss, sometimes you have to repeat yourself every now and then. You have to maybe talk a little bit more carefully and a little slower. And that's what it was like talking with Rick. So, I would say things a little bit slower. My sentences would be a little shorter. I would not speak louder, but I would make sure I articulated clearly. So it was that type of thing. And if I did that, he was great. Rarely did he ask me to repeat myself. In fact, I'm pretty sure he understood my speech by touching my face than I did his speech as I was listening to him. Why? Well, when one loses their hearing and sight, it's hard for them to articulate in a clear way often because they really don't get the feedback most of us get as we listen to our speech. And if a person is deaf, you'll learn about this later when we talk about lip reading, what they can often do is look at themselves in the mirror to know they're articulating clearly. Rick had neither of those methods of feedback. So he, his speech was difficult for me to understand sometimes. His mom was sitting in the room. She had to translate for me. But, we had a very productive conversation. And again, I think he understood my speech better by touching my face than I understood his speech. So I asked him about, talker differences and, whether some people are harder to hear than others, or some people are, easier to understand than others through touch. And he said, yes, people with beards are sometimes difficult. And I was worried because I have a beard. And he said, no, your beard is a hipster beard. It's finally, back then hipster beards were trimmed really close. I know hipsters have changed now. But he said my beard was fine. He said that men are easier for him to understand than women, and the hardest person for him to understand, he said, is his little girl. And the reason for that is because of the vibrations he can feel. He says men have more pronounced vibrations down here, so there's more vibration that he can feel. Women have a little less, but he can still understand women pretty well. So kids are really, really hard to understand because their vibrations, their voice boxes are small, and they don't have vibrations that are as easy for him to feel. And the vibrations, you could understand, are going to be important because, to distinguish, say, pa from ba, when the voice starts vibrating between pa and ba, really makes all the difference, whether we are able to perceive one or the other. For ba, the lips part and the voice vibrates about the same time. For pa, the lips part, and then a couple of milliseconds later, the voice vibrates. And that very kind of subtle distinction allows Rick to be able to perceive the difference. If he can't really feel very much about the voice vibration down here, he's going to have a really difficult time making that distinction, and that's why he has trouble with his daughter. His daughter had been learning sign, and they were communicating through tactile signs. So, he was doing the best he could with understanding her, and he clearly did understand most of what she was conveying. We talked a little bit about the hand configuration, as I said, and I already mentioned this, that he found it best to put his thumb underneath the lip of the person he was talking to. He felt that, really, as long as you're able to get a good sense of what this lower lip is doing, you basically know what both lips are doing. They're kind of, parting and moving in and out in the same way. So he didn't feel it was necessary to have his thumb across the lips. He knew that Helen Keller had done it in a completely different way and was also able to perceive. So, as long as certain things were being felt, the vibrations here, the jaw movement, the lip movement, of course, and he could feel the puffs of air going through the lips with the top of his thumb. He felt he had everything he needed. I asked him how he learned to do this. And what he said is he had a teacher that taught him basically through imitation. So by the time he was 2, and I think went completely blind and deaf, he had some sense of what language was. Hopefully you know something about Helen Keller, that she went blind and deaf earlier before she learned language, and had to really kind of be taught the conception of language. Rick had that conception. So he didn't need to be taught that there were such things as words that represented other things in the world, like a pizza cutter meant this, right? He knew that words represented things. So he wanted to learn words, and he had to do this through what he called kind of an imitation sort of game, going back and forth between him and his teacher. What that would involve is touching his own face and the face of the teacher, and then the teacher would make produce a word, pizza. And he would then try to kind of create that himself, with his lips and his vibration. And the teacher would say, shake her head, yes or no, and they go back and forth like this. And it did take a long time. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about how long this type of thing does take to get very, very good at it, like Rick was later on. But that was basically the training technique. It takes about 100 hours, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But what I like to do right now is take a second and answer some questions that you folks might have on Rick's technique. So let me stop sharing here and see if you folks have some questions about Rick. Okay. Oh, Liana, I'm so sorry. Liana says, I'm really gullible, so I actually started to believe about the Leaning Tower face. Okay, sorry. I can be like that sometimes. I just like to make up stories, That's why my kids won't talk to me. Okay, I'm just kidding. Aida asked, is Tadoma still being used by both deaf and blind individuals? Good question. I hope I answered that now. It is rarely used. It's not used nearly as much as it used to. And so I think for the most part, its use has to do with how scientists are actually interested in this type of thing. The fact that in any way that speech can be perceived through touch has been fascinating to scientists, including this scientist. We actually have an experiment. I had an experiment in our lab where we were testing this sort of thing, and I can tell you about that later on. The fact that language can actually be learned like this is really interesting to us. I think for the most part, it's more used in the laboratory than it is by the deaf and blind because of the sorts of things I talked about before. If Rick had known multiple languages, asks Ayana, do you think it would have been confusing for him to discern between the two languages when trying to Yeah, that's a great, great question. I don't know the answer to that when it comes to Tadoma. I can, however, tell you something about lip reading. People do learn to lip read multiple languages, and even without knowing the language, they can know almost right away whether or not somebody is speaking a different language, even if it's not a familiar language. Whether or not Rick would be able to distinguish between two languages that he had learned is a really good question, and I will look that up. I'm really interested. That might be the sort of thing that would be like in a some sort of biography of maybe Helen Keller, I don't know, or somebody else. There's other people that have had biographies on their life that use Tadoma, so I'll look that up. Did he have a distinguishable regional accent? That's a very good question, Owen. No, I would say not. His speech was very, very difficult to hear, to understand. I mean, you can understand if you couldn't hear your own speech, if you couldn't look at yourself in the mirror, it would be really difficult to get feedback on how clear your speech was. And I think that was exactly what was going on with him. So his speech was so, I mean, he'd have to repeat himself, say, every 3 or 4 sentences for me to understand him. He just asked me to repeat myself maybe every 10 sentences. But it was difficult to understand his speech. And he also said that he likes to practice his own speech, and he feels his face as he practices his speech, but he hadn't practiced in a while, so he felt a little embarrassed that his speech wasn't clear. He said it had been much clearer at different points in his life, but he hadn't practiced in a long time. So his speech was hard to hear. So the answer to the question is I don't think I'd be able to discern an accent because his speech was so distorted because of his lack of getting feedback on his speech. Other questions about Rick? I mean, it doesn't have to be about Tadoma. It can be about anything about his life. If anyone's interested, it's just tremendous. I'll be honest with you. Before I met him, I drove up to the San Francisco area to meet him. I really thought this could be a difficult thing for me. I could find this that he's a very isolated individual. I had just been communicating with him over email a little bit, and I thought, this could be a little difficult. I didn't know he had a wife. I didn't know he had kids. I didn't know that his mom would be there. I didn't know that he had such a successful life. And it was really heartwarming that, kind of the human spirit, with the critical tool of language allows somebody to kind of, build this kind of very engaged social life for themselves. It was something. It really was something. And as I understand, according to him, he has a lot of friends that have been deafblind through the years, from school and all that. And they also have, built themselves really, really nice, kind of engaged lives, which is just tremendous. You'd ask, if Tadoma is not used more often, how do deaf and blind communicate with others? People who are deaf and blind. Okay, so I did mention that most people who are born deaf-blind now, and there aren't as many, let's hope rubella does not come back, but there aren't nearly as many as there used to be, they get cochlear implants almost immediately. That's often the case. Other than that, they will use tactile sign. They will use devices in which a speech recognition device could, in fact, create Braille spontaneously. There are now many new technologies to kind of allow a deaf-blind person to have that communication. But I would say the vast majority now are getting cochlear implants, which allow them, that functionally, kind of puts them in a position to be, kind of to have the communication skills of a blind person, not a deaf-blind person. Okay, anything else? I guess we can do a question. I'm trying to see if I can use this thing. Let's do a question then. Yeah, this is a good one. Let's do one about the tongue display unit. Does that sound fun? Tongue display unit. Okay, I'll read the question first. Having patterned electrode activity on your tongue with the tongue display unit, A, allows you to perceive lines and curves of various orientation. B allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body instead of the tongue after some practice. C induces activity in visual brain regions after some practice. Or D, all of the above. Okay, I'll launch the poll, see how you do, and we'll talk about the answer. Looks like people are doing pretty well. Okay, most people have answered. Let's give you another 15 seconds. Yeah, too easy. It was too easy. I'll share the results and we can look at it together. People, that's not showing up for me. There's not that kind of big blue line on the bottom. But the answer, of course, is all of the above. 95% of you got that. Just a couple of people got B and C incorrect. So it is the case that all these things are true of the tongue display unit. It allows you to perceive lines and curves of various orientation. And that's something that happens fairly early on in one's use of the tongue display unit. B, it allows you to experience perceived objects outside the body. And that's really, really important. Are some people not seeing the results? I think I'm sharing. I don't know what's happening. Tell me if, say yes or no if you can see the results. Just a few people, yes or no. Can you see the results of this poll? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. I guess a couple of people aren't. I don't know why that happens. And I apologize. Maybe if I move it around on the screen, does that help? I don't know. Okay, sorry about that. But the correct answer, again, is D. It allows you to, so we're at question B, it allows you to experience objects outside the body. And this is important. Remember, I talked about, that's about when the visual brain seems to become involved. Even though you're blindfolded, even if you're blind, when you're using the tongue display unit, after a lot of practice, you start not to just feel things on your tongue, but you actually get to have a sense of things outside your body, like you're perceiving things out in the world. And that is a really useful thing, of course, to use the unit. And that's about when your visual brain becomes involved. And that's the answer. That was the answer C. It induces activity in the visual brain after some practice. And so that's also true. So the final answer is all the above. Okay. Any questions on that? I apologize that I'm not seeing all the answer either. So again, I think this polling function isn't 100% working, but it works well enough for us to be able to use it. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so how do I look there? Good. Okay, I've changed my room around here, so it's much more comfortable. I want to make sure I look as snazzy as I ever have. I think I look ridiculously snazzy. Okay, let's continue talking then and go back to where we just were. And there are a couple of things I want to now start talking about with regard to the Tadoma technique and what we know about how it works with regard to what the brain is doing. One thing we know with individuals, not only like Rick Joy, but individuals like you and me who would go into a scanner and touch a face, right? Even though we have never done it before, something very interesting happens. Almost immediately, it not only activates parts of the brain that are associated with touch, you know, you're touching a face and your brain's being imaged. Not only does it activate parts of the brain that are associated with touch, the strip here, but it very quickly activates parts of the brain that are involved in auditory perception and visual perception. And that's really interesting from a scientific perspective, right? I mean, we talked about this before. This is a little bit about this cross-sensory kind of plasticity stuff and things like that, or cross-sensory activation. This happens if you're, listening to speech. I'm sorry, you're watching somebody move their mouth as if they're speaking. We know, as we'll talk about later, that it does activate auditory cortex. But what's interesting about this case is that this is a means by which people have rarely, if ever, perceived speech previously in their lives. So let's not talk about Rick Joy now. Let's talk about you and me. I mean, maybe when you're a baby, you touched your parent's face a little bit. Probably not for the purposes of perceiving speech too much. When you're in a romantic situation, maybe you touch the face of your significant other, but again, not for the purposes of perceiving speech. However, when people are asked to do this, even if it's the first time in their life, already their auditory brain and visual brain seems to get involved. Imagine you're the person who's in charge of the brain there. You're pulling all the levers in your brain, and your person goes ahead and touches a face, and you get this kind of weird information from a face that's talking through touch. It's like, holy cow, what is this? This is cool. I have no idea what to make of this. Let's get the auditory brain and visual brain involved and see if we can figure out what's going on. And maybe somebody's saying something, and it happens almost immediately, even though it's not something that, again, the brain has necessarily experienced before, which is really, really interesting from a scientific perspective, that the auditory brain, the visual brain can get involved so quickly, even though it's not really based on any sort of obvious tactile or touch experience, right? Very cool. So how much can be perceived from these folks? Let's talk a little bit about the research on Tadoma now. And there you're seeing actually one of the original researchers a long time ago, Al Bregman was the name of the researcher. And he's actually touching the face of two people, and both deaf and blind. And this is something that Rick Joy has experienced a number of times. He used to do it in school when he was younger all the time with other deaf-blind individuals, where they have three-way conversations. A lot of our conversations are, exciting conversations and three-way conversations. And this is how they would do it. They would use one hand to touch one person, another hand to touch another person, and it was effective. It's just amazing. For folks who have some experience, like Rick Joy, it's thought that they can get about 90% of the sentences that they are feeling on a person's face, which is really amazing. And I would say that's about what Rick was able to get from me. I would say about, if I was talking again slow and, kind of carefully, I didn't exaggerate my lip movements or anything like that. It was like talking to your grandparents at a noisy restaurant, right? He would get 90% easily. Maybe once every 10 sentences, he would ask me to repeat myself or something like that. But, again, it was just astonishing that he could get that much information out of touching a face. So yes, I would say that kind of success is similar to speech in a noisy background. Or, even if those of us that have most of our hearing still, you guys, more than me, if you are listening to somebody at a party with loud music or a lot of chatter in the background, I would say 1 out of every 10 sentences needs to be repeated for you. So Rick was kind of as good as you would be at a noisy party, which is pretty tremendous. You, in fact, could learn Tadoma if you had, and maybe you do now, 100 hours to practice it. So that's something that the original researchers did, is they took some, I guess, graduate students, would be my guess, into the lab and say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have you see if you can learn this Tadoma technique. And so they blindfolded the grad students, and I think they had them wear earplugs and headphones, so they really couldn't understand what the person was saying. That's how we do it. We have them wear both earplugs, and then we have headphones on top of the earplugs, and then we have what's called white noise being played to their ears. It sounds like this, shh, like that. And they really can't hear. We make sure they can't hear what the person is saying like that. And we blindfold them, of course. And then, in these old experiments, they would have their grad students touch somebody else's face, and the person would speak, and the grad student would have to touch the face and determine what the person said, what sentence it was or something, and then get feedback on how well they did at guessing what that sentence was. And they said that about 100 hours of training, you can get to where Rick Joy is Rick Joy proficiency. You could probably understand somebody that you just met about 90% of the time. Okay. So that's, I mean, you can understand it would take a long time to do this. And it really just is practice. Once you get your hand on there, it's not like there's that much, kind of like specific instruction, like you have to, for this word, you have to feel this vibration, for that word, you have to feel that vibration. It's not anything as explicit, the teaching, as that. It's more just like touching the face and practicing, trying to figure out what's being said, with different types of words. So yes, 100 hours of practice. But, and you're going to find this really interesting, it is something that we can do immediately to a small but important extent. And remember, this is one of the things that the book is about, is to trying to find the sort of perceptual potential that we have. And yes, we can become somebody that's a good Tadoma user with 100 hours, but even with no hours, you could sit there, touch a person's face, and a couple of things would happen. First of all, spontaneously, touching a face is known immediately to enhance noisy speech that's that has a noisy background, or lip-read speech. So let's imagine this. You put on headphones and you are listening to somebody say sentences, simple sentences like the football game is over, the ball fell from the window, the flowers are on the table. Those are the type of sentences we use in our lab to study this sort of thing. And then you find it difficult because those sentences are kind of spoken against a background of that noise. That's the noise. And so they're hard to hear. Maybe you get every third, every fourth word or something like that. You do your best guesses, but you have difficulty because these are noisy sentences, right? And there's other ways to create the noise. You can create background noise by actually having people chatter in the background. It causes the same thing. We have trouble hearing speech in that context. But if you're listening to speech like that over headphones, you're blindfolded, so you don't see anything, but you're touching a face as you're listening to that noisy speech. Your speech comprehension goes way up, like astonishingly better. Like rather than getting every third word, maybe you're getting 2 out of 3 keywords in a sentence. Your comprehension increases 50 to 60% by touching a face. And people will say, I can't believe this is so much easier. I've never touched a face before, but it really helps in this case to touch a face for me to understand more of what's being said in the noisy speech. Another example, okay, people come into the lab, and we run a lot of experiments where people come to the lab and think what we're asking them to do is a trick, that there's no way they can perform this skill, like the echolocation stuff. But they come to the lab and they watch a face speak, and they're not listening to anything in sound. In fact, what they're getting through the headphones is that really kind of striking noise on top of the earplugs. So they hear nothing at all. They're just watching somebody speak, and they're, again, trying to figure out what's being said by lip reading, intentionally, like for the first time in their lives, or, close to the first time probably. And they have difficulty. Again, maybe they get 1 out of every 3 words or something like that. But then, if we ask them to touch the face that they are looking at, again, no sound, they're just touching and watching, their comprehension goes way up again, about as much as it did when it enhanced the hearing. Now they get every, 2 out of 3 words. They really improve to the point where, they get many, if not most, of the sentences correct by not listening to the speech, but doing the combination of watching the person speak and touching the person speak. Both things that people who come to the lab think, I can't do this, but they're amazed. They can do it really, really well. And finally, I want to say this, and this is a little bit going to be a tiny bit complicated because we haven't talked about this idea of how the senses integrate for speech, but we will in some detail soon. We're going to talk specifically about how lip-read speech integrates with heard speech. Okay, but now we're going to talk about how felt speech integrates with heard speech. And in these experiments, subjects naive, like that have good hearing and sight, come into the laboratory. They are blindfolded. There's no lip reading going on here. And they are touching the face of a speaker. And I should say, when people are asked to do this, we do this in our lab, they wear rubber gloves and all that. You know, since the virus hit, we, of course, can't do any of these things, and we won't do any of these things until, you know, there's a vaccine and all that. But, you know, back in the old days, people used to come to our labs, touch a face, and try to determine what was said. And in this particular experiment, people would come into the lab, touch a face, and the face would just say simple syllables, okay? Ba, va. And if you want to touch your own face there at home, you can do this. Ba, va, ta. And you can imagine being able to distinguish between a few of these different syllables. I think maybe ba I could feel, va I could feel, versus da. Yeah, so ba, va, da. If I were to give you a choice of which of those three I was articulating, I would say, even if it's the first time you've ever touched my face, you'd be able to do it. That would be my guess. And so people would come into this experiment, conducted not in our lab, in another one, where they would touch the face. It was first determined that, yes, people could distinguish these syllables. And then they would listen to headphones in which different syllables were actually spoken. So let me give you a clear example. They would feel a face articulating va as synchronously as they heard in their headphones a voice speaking ba. So it was timed. The experimenter also listened to the headphones, so they timed their articulation. So when a ba was heard, okay, va was the articulation that the speaker would make. And then the subjects would be asked, what did you just hear? Okay, so ba is coming through their headphones, but they're feeling the face produced va. Okay, they're feeling a face articulating a very clear va synchronously, and it would influence what they ended up hearing. They would say, oh, well, I'm perceiving va. I'm hearing va, even though what was coming through their headphones was a clear ba. What they felt influenced what they heard. And that's what that last part of that slide says. Heard speech is influenced by felt speech, even though it's not something that people have ever really done before. They haven't, most of these folks had never touched a face before for the purposes of perceiving speech. Okay? So not only can we use the information from a face immediately, it can help us enhance auditory speech, it can help us enhance visual speech that's, you know, difficult to use. It can integrate and actually influence what is heard. It's as if, and I'm going to say this again later on, but it's a kind of, this is the big part of the story here. It's as if the speech part of our brain doesn't really care where the information comes from. Yeah, I mean, it's used to hearing speech, and then sometimes it's used to hearing and seeing speech, but rarely is it used to touching speech. But the speech brain says, I just want to know what's going on with the speaker. What are they articulating? And I don't care if it's heard, seen, or felt. The speech brain just wants to know what the articulation, what the speech movements of the person are. Okay? And that's going to be an important sort of kind of lesson for us as we go on and try to understand multisensory perception later on in the quarter. But I thought it was a really important and really cool thing here. So the answer is, can you Tadoma? Well, not like Rick Joy, not like Helen Keller, but you can do it to the extent that you actually integrate what you feel with what you hear spontaneously. Okay, let's shift now and talk about some other things. Let's talk about feeling things without touching them. That's kind of a weird idea, right? And what I'm going to do here is maybe start with an example. See, sure, it's a bummer doing Zoom classes, but there are some advantages to Zoom class, which is that I have access to everything in my garage, including this pole that I've affixed this little clamp to. Okay. Now, I would imagine you'd feel the same way. If you were blindfolded and this was put in your hand And if you were asked, is there a weight on here? And if so, which direction is the weight facing? You would probably be able to do it. Okay, you'd say, it's facing to the right in this case. It's my right. Okay, my right. If it were put my hand this way, I'd say, oh, yeah, it's facing to my left. And I'd say, okay, now what we're going to do is we're just going to constrain your movement. You can't even move your wrist to the side. Instead, we want you to just move it up and down like this. Is there a weight? And if there is, which direction is the weight positioned? And so I'm able to make a judgment about this without seeing it and without touching it. And this is what I'm trying to convey here. This is what it means that I can feel something. I can know something's there through my touch system, but without directly touching it. And this happens all the time. Let's see, what else can I use? It happens when you use your cell phone. Okay, you're holding your cell phone like this, right? And often when we hold our cell phones, we're not necessarily looking at our hand. Maybe you just picked it up like this, and you know immediately which way the cell phone is hanging because of what's going on in your limbs. Okay, so you can correct it immediately. Anything like this, when we grab just a piece of it, we can perceive much more of it. That's kind of the point here. You grab something by a little tiny piece of what it is, and you can perceive much more of it. Its extent, the way that the weight is distributed. Okay, wow, I'm using every prop in my garage, right? You can determine how big its end is. You get the idea, right? I'm touching just a very, very little piece of this item, but I can tell so much about where this thing is, how this thing is kind of constructed relative to where I'm touching it, what the shape of the thing is, what its weight distribution is. And that's what I'm talking about in these examples. The way I'm able to do this is through what I'll call the muscle tendon system. It's a tiny bit technical, but it's something that you'll easily understand. Don't worry about the picture. I'll talk about that in just a second. But, when you touch something, let's use this weight. That's the most obvious thing. I think you'll be able to get it like this. It's a little heavy. And what that's doing is it is stretching the muscles in my wrist and the tendons in my wrist, the things that kind of connect the muscles to the bones and all that sort of stuff. These things are being stretched. And when these things are stretched, the muscles and tendons, we have little tiny sensors in them, okay? Little tiny sensors that tell our brain they are being stretched. Okay? So this is something the brain is looking for. It wants to know what the body is doing. And one of the easiest ways for it to know what the body is doing is to kind of detect what's going on in these little muscles and little tendons here. And the cool thing is, and the reason I wanted to use this in the book is because this muscle tendon system turns out to be much more sophisticated than you could ever imagine. Okay? It can pick up so much information about things that we aren't directly touching, okay? Like the weights up here. And so in these sorts of experiments, oh, by the way, I'll just very quickly, if you want to look at this anatomy here, there's a muscle, there's the tendon, and there are little sensors in here. They go to our nervous system, and that's going to be something ultimately that can be detected by the brain, so we can make judgments about these sorts of things. So in these experiments that I'm referencing here, very simple. Basically, there's a subject, and they are positioned on the side of a very big kind of barrier, so they can't see what's going on the other side of the barrier. And then, without looking at their hand, they are given a rod to hold, very, very much like this. I've been a subject in these experiments back at graduate school, and it kind of is like this. I'm given a rod to hold, and I'm asked to judge how long it is. What's the length of the rod? So imagine, let's pretend this thing isn't on here, this clamp isn't on here right now. what is the length of this rod? And the only thing I'm allowed to do is to move my wrist back and forth like this, just like this, okay? And so as I do that, I then have to make a judgment of the length of the rod, not in inches or feet. Usually in these sorts of experiments, people are asked to position, a board at the length of the rod, but you don't need to worry about that right now. But just ask how long the rod is. And I turn out to be very, very good, as does everybody else in these experiments. They can do a good job making these sort of judgments. They can also tell where their grip is on the rod. Okay, are they holding it in the middle? Are they holding it at the end? As well as the other thing I just mentioned, if there's a bend in the rod or if there's weights displaced to one side or the other, they can tell that very easily. Again, not by looking, just by moving their wrists back and forth. Okay? And maybe even more astonishing than that is another experiment I got to be in as a subject back when I was in graduate school. This just floored me, but it turned out to be a really, really kind of cool kind of insight by the scientists. People can tell the shape of an object without directly touching it. And in this experiment, I should have figured out a way of building one of these in my garage here. People were asked to grab a little handle that was always the same size, and you can imagine all these things were made out of wood, by the way. They're asked to grab a little handle that's always the same size and just to kind of shift it back and forth in the same way you saw me shifting back and forth the rod just there. And as I do that, I look on the other side of the barrier, the part I can see, and I'm asked to say, which of these shapes do you think you're wielding? That's what I mean by wielding. You know, you're shaking back and forth. I know you're not touching the shapes with your skin, but as you rock the shape back and forth with your wrist, can you tell which shape it is? And people can do it really, really well. They can do it even if the objects are actually different sizes. So if they're wielding a large shape, they can look at the small shapes and tell you, oh, well, yeah, what I'm wielding here is probably a pyramid, like this person is doing right here. But it's probably bigger than what the shapes you're showing me right now, or vice versa. Okay? So again, you're able to feel detail without touching the object's detail itself. Always, the only thing the skin is touching in these examples is just this little post right here, which is the same little post that's attached to all the objects. You can feel all this detail just by moving your wrist back and forth. Okay? How are we able to do this? Well, it's thought that what you're doing here, and I'm not too interested you understand the physics, the technicalities of this, I just want you to understand the idea, is that when you move your wrist back and forth, it's not easily as movable in all directions, okay? So as it moves back and forth, there's going to be various resistances that are going to be imparted to the muscles and tendons here as you're moving back and forth, okay? As it does that, our little sensors in our muscles and tendons go to the spinal cord and go to the brain and say, hey, brain, you're shaking something now. You're wielding something that has a certain shape to it. You're not touching that shape with your skin, but based on the way these little deformations occur in your wrist, muscles and tendons, you can tell that type of thing. So it's thought it's kind of more technical than this, but you know, as long as you understand the idea that it's a specific resistance to rotation. How easy is it to rotate one way versus the other? And can those resistances be determined just from doing this? And the answer is absolutely. What else can people tell? Well, sweet spots. Do you know what a sweet spot is? That's why I have the tennis racket here. I guess different rackets with different shapes, different sizes, have sweet spots in different positions. And so I guess for this racket, I don't know where it would probably be up here somewhere, maybe. I don't know. My son's on the high school tennis team. I should have asked him, you know, about this sort of thing. but even people who don't play tennis can kind of judge where they would want to hit the ball in order to get the most kind of bang for the buck, right? So if a tennis serve were coming to you, where would you want the ball to be hit on the racket so you can get the strongest shot back? And I would say right here, that would be it. Right there, that would be my strongest return, okay, return shot, okay? And people turn out to be really good at this, at judging these sort of things, because they're going to be, a smaller racket will have that sweet spot shifted down. A larger racket would have it shifted up. If it were a wider racket, it would also have it shifted and maybe be more towards the center. And people, regardless of their tennis experience, are pretty darn good at this. They can determine the sweet spot of a racket that they cannot see, but only shake. Again, it's one of those experiments. It's hard to tell from this particular image on the slide here. But again, they can't see the racket. They're only given the racket behind a wall. They're told to do this and say, now move a tennis ball on the other side of the wall so it's positioned where you think the sweet spot is of the racket, okay? And people are very, very, very good at this sort of thing. And if tennis isn't your game and you're a hockey player, I know, there's lots of hockey players down here in Southern California not. I think there's some, maybe you were. It's the exact same thing and the exact same experiment. I think this one was done with a college hockey team, to determine where the best part of the stick's blade is to hit a puck, so it's a slap shot if it can go into the net with the most velocity. And it's the same sort of thing. People can do that really, really, really well. Okay, other things, yeah. Hammers, yeah, you think that'd be the one thing I could pull out of my garage. I forgot to bring it up, but you know what a hammer looks like. If you want to grab pretend this is a hammer. If you want to grab a hammer for the, the biggest hit, so you can drive that nail in fast, and what you do is you grab it towards the bottom. If instead it's a very small nail and you want to drive it in, but you don't want to mark up the wood that's next to it, you want to be precise in where you're hammering, you would know to grab it in probably a higher spot on this. And again, this would all be from not looking. In all these experiments, these are all just asking people to shake their wrists back and forth. They're really, really accurate about the best place to use a hammer, regardless of their hammering experience. It's not just, carpenters that are good with this sort of thing. Everybody can do this with a lot of precision. It's pretty amazing. Finally, I've been kind of emphasizing the the wrist system in performing these tasks. Again, people aren't able to see the objects. They're just moving their wrists back and forth. But it's not just the wrist system that allows this. There's other experiments very much like this that show that people can do this kind of wielding with their ankles, with their knees, and their fingertips. So you could strap this rod. It might be hard to do for my foot. No, you could do it. You could strap this rod to my foot. Again, I'd be blindfolded. I didn't know what was going on. You could strap it to my foot. I would move my foot up and down like this and make these judgments about the rod length, the grip position, where is it strapped to my foot, as well as whether there's a bend one way or the other, okay? You could then strap it to my lower leg and have me just move my knee up and down, again, without looking. I guess in this case, what would I want to do? I guess I'd be lying on a table or something like that. My leg is kind of off the table. It's strapped to my leg, not my foot this time, but now my lower leg. I'm moving my knee up and down, and it's the same thing. Finally, with small objects, you can, probably not that. I don't know, probably this. Yeah, you probably could do it with this. Their wrist is affixed to the chair. Again, they're blindfolded. They're just moving their fingers back and forth, and it's the exact same thing. The point is, all of this detail, all of this kind of shape and weight and position detail can be apprehended just from a very, very small part of the body. We've been talking about the wrist system, and just those little sensors in the muscles and tendons of the wrist allow you to, again, not just determine that your wrist is moving, but determine what the shape is, whether it's a pyramid or a sphere or a square or whatever, just by moving this. And that's what I mean here by being able to feel things without touching them with your skin. Okay, we'll see more examples of that in just a second, but let's go ahead and stop our share and see if there's any questions and do another poll. Are there any questions on either the Tadoma stuff we just talked about or this wrist tendon stuff? Is there, okay, Aida asks, is there a Tadoma experiment in UCR? You know, Aida, there was. We were doing an experiment at UCR with Tadoma and collecting data, and obviously had to stop as soon as the quarantine hit. So it's unclear when we'll be able to start that. I imagine even when we're back on campus and able to do research in our laboratories, that's probably going to be the last experiment that's going to be up and running because of the obvious reasons that people's faces have to be touched for this purpose. Other questions either about Tadoma or the stuff I just talked about with regard to wielding and judging things without touching them? Anything? Oh boy. Oh boy. Okay, I'll tell you what. I can tell you're a little sleepy. Let's do one more question and then we'll kind of pep things up a little bit. How's that sound? Okay, let's do a poll about Tadoma. Here you go. I'll read it first, then give it to you. Tadoma is a technique Helen Keller used to perceive speech from individuals who didn't know sign language. B, can automatically integrate with heard speech. C, takes about 100 hours to master, or D, all of the above. It's too easy. Okay, I'll give that to you anyway. Life's too easy for you guys today. You might get this on your test, hint, hint. So let's just go ahead and do it anyway. Yeah. Okay, everyone's gonna get it right, I can tell. It's just too easy, especially since you just had the lecture, right? That's not fair. All right. Are you guys allowed to change your answers after you do an answer? I think you are, right? Yeah, okay. Well, I'm going to stop it here. I think that's good. So yes, I'm sharing right now. Hopefully you're able to see it shared. Tadoma is a technique that Helen Keller used. That's absolutely true, but it's not just that. It can integrate with heard speech, right? We just talked about that fact a couple of slides ago. It takes about 100 hours to master. And we talked about that not just for someone like Rick Joy, but someone like you, if you were to try to learn Tadoma in the laboratory. Even though you have good hearing and sight, you could learn to do it well after about 100 hours. So the correct answer is D, and the vast majority of you folks got this. So it's all the above. All right. Then in the interest of attention, I've wanted to be this guy the entire class because I just think he's wonderful. Where is he here? I am going to finish the class. Where is he? Shoot. Sorry, I promise this will be well worth it. You'll say, oh my gosh, why can't he always be this guy when he teaches? Why can't he always be? A wise turtle. All right. Oh, look at that. The turtle's got problems. Oh, I don't want to do that. Shoot. That's a bummer. Hold on. Let me just try this. There we go. Now I'm a wise turtle. All right. Well, I'm going to do the end of the lecture. Oh, I can't. Shoot. I can't do this. I'm sorry. Sorry, everybody. I have to use my hands for this. Yeah. All right. Well, that's what I would have looked like. But instead, I'm going to have to do it this way. Sorry, everybody. Okay. But you got to see me as a turtle. So that's kind of fun. Shoot. Okay. I want to talk to you about another person I interviewed whose name is Rick PSYC. And Rick is a fly fisherman. He teaches fly fishing. And fly fishing is a really interesting sort of hobby because what fly fishing involves, it's not like regular fishing. So I never, did fly fishing. I did kind of regular fishing with my regular fishing pool where you kind of just, cast out and pull back. And the cast, you try to aim it kind of well. Or you can just drop the line, from the dock or your boat or wherever you're fishing from. And, you do pretty well that way. Certainly my kids did it that way. Now, is this a little hard to see in the green screen? Okay, sorry, just let me do this. Yeah, oh gosh. Let me make sure we have everything going here, guys. No, what's going on? All right, I'm sorry. Well, you don't need this. Okay, this is kind of a disaster today. Okay, so we have this fishing rod, and what I'm going to do is talk about Rick as a person who can do things a lot more accurately than you and I can do with a regular fishing rod. So the way fly fishing works is that the line itself, so when you went fishing when you were a kid with your parents, the line would have some sort of weight on the end, and it would bring the line down under the water to some degree. But the way fly fishing works is that you actually have a line that floats on the water. So it stays, above the water, the line. It's kind of a plastic thing. And at the end of the line, there's a little fly. It's a little I guess it looks like a simulated fly. It's kind of a fancy tied lure that acts like a fly, that looks like a fly for the fish. And the job for the fly fisherman is to actually be very precise as to where they're putting that lure, where they're putting that fly that then has the line that's going to float on the water. So the fly and the line don't go underwater. They stay on top of the water, just like a real fly would that the fish wants to eat. So the fish that they're going for are fish that can jump up, grab the fly that's at the top of the water, and then run with it and have dinner. Okay. So it's a different type of fishing that involves a lot more practice and especially a lot more precision when it comes to casting and feeling what's on the line. And that's what I'm most interested in now, is conveying that to you. Just very quickly on how this has to happen, what Rick needs to do is it usually takes like 2 or 3 movements like this, and then he's holding, as you can see there, he's holding the line and lets go as he then casts the rod out. And that involves some degree of, kind of careful touch perception on the rod itself. But really what I'm most interested in is how Rick and other expert fly fishermen are able to determine what is on their line when they have something on their line, because he says he's typically fishing in muddy water in rivers that are flowing pretty quickly, so it's hard for him to see when the fish has the lure, when the fish has the hook. So again, there's a little fly at the end of his line. It's a simulated fly. It's a lure that has a hook in it, and when the fish takes that lure, he's got the hook in him, and Rick needs to know when that occurs, and interestingly, he can tell a lot of other things from that as well. Okay, so as he's holding the rod like this, okay, he can tell, of course, when the lure is taken, but he can also tell other things, like the type of fish that has taken the lure. He says that the type of bass, it's a rock bass or a big mouth bass. He can feel that as the rod starts to move, even without looking at the rod. He says, yeah, I can feel that in the handle of the fishing rod. I can do this with my eyes closed. Typically, as I'm doing this, as I'm fishing, I'm talking to other people because he's an instructor. And I know what's going on with the rod, with the line, as the different fish grab the lure, all through touching here. Okay, so he can tell the type, the gender, the age of the fish, that sort of thing. He can tell if a fish is going to, which direction the fish is swimming in. And importantly, he can also tell if the fish is going to jump. So here's the deal with these fish. They're smart. What do I mean by that they're smart? I mean that they you know, in that part where he fishes, which is up in Canada somewhere, it's a kind of catch and return, catch and release sort of situation. So he never brings the fish back. He always catches them and releases them. And so the fish have learned different techniques to get off the hook. And one of the most common techniques to get off the hook is to as soon as they're hooked, what they'll do is they'll dive down very deep into the water and then jump up into the air, out of the surface of the water into the air. And what that does is it loosens the line enough potentially so the hook falls out of their mouth. Okay? And so he has to know when that's going to happen. So what he does is when he feels the fish go down, he will say, he bows to the fish like this. And what that will do is it will kind of tighten the line in a direction lower. So when the fish comes up out of the water, the hook stays in the fish's mouth. He needs to know all these things about the fish, how the fish is going to behave based on its type, its species, whether it's male or female. He says, yeah, the males tend to be feistier. And the older fish, because they have a lot of experience of having been caught and released, they know a lot of techniques. And he can tell all these things just by what's going on here with the vibrations of his rod. And what we're talking about here, and what we were talking about a little bit before, was something that I like to label proxy touch. And what is proxy touch? Proxy touch is just touching things through a tool. And this is the tool we're talking about right now. It's the tool of the fishing rod. It's not the only time we or a person can experience proxy touch. We are experiencing proxy touch all the time. In fact, if you're taking notes right now with a pen, you are feeling the notebook, the paper, through the pen itself. Okay? So we will talk about proxy touch and some of the details of proxy touch next class. We'll see you then.